Well, I think there is no question that we are going to have, for as far as the eye can see, an intense security competition between the United States and China. And I believe that there will be crises along the way, crises involving the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and Taiwan. I think that's unavoidable. The really important question is whether we can manage those crises and avoid a war. I think a war over Taiwan or even a war over the South China Sea would be a disaster. I think the problem is that once the war started, it would probably be very hard to shut down, just like we're seeing in Eastern Europe with the Ukraine war. It's very hard to shut that war down. So that's what I really worry about, that security competition morphing into a war. Do I think that with good management, we can, get through the next however many years or however many decades without a war? I think there's a serious possibility that that's true. But I think there's a non-trivial chance that we will end up in a war. You want to remember what I said before, John. The problem in East Asia is that it's easy to imagine a conflict in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea or over Taiwan, or even a conflict up in the Himalayas between India and China. It's much different than during the Cold War, when it was really hard to imagine fighting a war in Central Europe because it would have been so horrible. So my point again is the fact that, you have these scenarios that, could very well happen that are not that horrible, not as horrible as a war in Central Europe, makes one very nervous. Now, a possible counter to that argument is, look, we live in a nuclear world. And even a minor conflict in the South China Sea or a minor conflict over Taiwan runs the risk of escalating to the nuclear level. And that threat should go a long way towards preventing a great power war in East Asia. I think that's an argument that has a lot of punch. I don't dismiss that argument for 1 second, right? The presence of nuclear weapons makes war less likely. But again, you can even imagine a war in the South China Sea where nuclear weapons are employed, because those are nuclear weapons being employed out in the ocean. And that's not the same as nuclear weapons being employed in Central Europe or being employed on the Chinese mainland. So again, maybe war is more likely than a lot of people who believe in the nuclear revolution recognize. So I'm trying to say here that it's a complicated matter where it's almost impossible to come up with firm probabilities as to how likely it is that we will have a war. Again, I think it's axiomatic that we're going to have security competition, and it will be intense security competition most of the time. But whether or not you get a war, I don't know for sure. But I do think, and this is my bottom line, there is a non-trivial chance that the United States will end up fighting China in the decades ahead.